It will be challenging for Ukraine to continue its counteroffensive against Russian forces, and the cost of the operation to retake territory is likely to be high. In a number of locations, military officials from Ukraine reported progress along the front line on Friday. The Ukrainian attack has begun, and they are steadily progressing. This fight is extremely difficult. Because of how violent it is, it will take a lot of time and cost a lot of money. Because the war was a marathon rather than a sprint, Kyiv needed support now and in the future. Ukraine maintained sufficient firepower to launch its counteroffensive despite Russia's initial losses. The Ukrainian counteroffensive, which is still in its infancy, is expected to encounter decisive battles, according to military analysts. Ukraine has reclaimed at least 7 communities and approximately 72 square kilometers of land so far in 2 significant pushes in the south. Ukrainian troops are making progress despite intense fighting and the Russian army's superior aviation and artillery capabilities. The vital trial of Ukraine's hostile, nonetheless, is coming up soon on the grounds that Ukrainian powers have not yet arrived at the most strong Russian protected positions, which are found some separation from the forefront. Kyiv is believed to have prepared an attack force consisting of 12 brigades each with 1,000 troops, the majority of which were recently imported Western armored vehicles. Russia has recently intensified its bombing campaign, despite President Vladimir Putin's admission that his army lacks drones and missiles. After a week of intense fighting, Kyiv's counteroffensive faces real challenges. Ukrainian troops are just a few miles from Russia's primary defensive line, and the majority of the forces prepared for the push are still on alert. Russia has established thousands of defensive positions, including rows of asphalt, anti-tank ditches and landmines, from the western border of Russia to the occupied Crimea on the Black Sea. Military experts say that Ukraine, which has most of its counteroffensive forces ready to go, can watch where Moscow sends troops to fortify its defenses and attack areas with weaker defenses, like the east. Ukrainian and American officials acknowledged on Thursday that Ukraine's counteroffensive against formidable Russian defenses has been exhausting and bloody. However, they insisted that it is making progress and that any judgment regarding its success is extremely premature. Kyiv launched a multi-pronged assault into Moscow's seized territory in southeastern Ukraine last week, looking for weaknesses to exploit in order to break through the Russians' extensive network of minefields, trenches, bunkers, tank obstacles, and artillery. In the beginning, Ukraine retook some small villages and settlements. According to independent analysts, Kyiv's recent advancements in the Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia regions are more accurately measured in yards than in miles. Late on Thursday, Ms. Maliar reported additional gains. "The attack is moving in all directions," she said. She stated that Ukrainian forces had advanced about a mile in the direction of Berdyansk and Mariupol, 2 important coastal cities that the Russians had long held. Lloyd G. Austin, IE, the Secretary of Defense for the United States, and General Mark A. Milley, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, both acknowledged that Ukraine's forces were encountering a fierce resistance and were suffering losses in terms of both human casualties and the Western tanks and other armored vehicles that had recently been provided to them. However, they stated at a news conference in Brussels that such difficulties were anticipated and that they continue to have high expectations. They were there to meet with representatives from NATO nations and the larger group of nations supporting Ukraine's war effort separately. Mr. Austin, a former Army general, stated, "War is fluid, dynamic, and unpredictable. The battle in Ukraine is not a straightforward sprint to victory. We know that there will be battle damage on both sides," he continued. However, he claimed that Ukraine was capable of recovering and repairing some of its damaged armored vehicles. This week, Russian President Vladimir V. Putin made a rare public admission that Russia was facing challenges of its own. These challenges included a lack of precision munitions and disagreements between the military command and Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner private military group that led the Russian assault on the city of Bakhmut. However, Mr. Putin made unconfirmed claims in an interview with journalists on Tuesday that Ukraine's offensive was stumbling, and that it had recently lost 3 times as many tanks as Russia. Rafael Mariano Grossi, the head of the United Nations nuclear energy watchdog, went into the war zone on Thursday to see the threatened Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which Russian forces had held since last year. Because the destruction of the Kakhovka dam last week had drained the reservoir that supplies water to prevent the plant's nuclear fuel from melting, Mr. Grossi, head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, cited new safety concerns. He tweeted about the concern but did not say what he had discovered after crossing the front line to get to the plant. Russia, which invaded Ukraine nearly 16 months ago, has increased its missile and drone attacks on targets far from the front line, frequently civilian targets. For weeks, it focused on Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, but this week it turned its attention to other cities. In and around Kyiv, Ukraine's air defenses have developed to a very high level and are capable of taking out the majority of the munitions used by attackers. However, they are dispersed elsewhere. A missile struck the city of Kryvyi Rih on Thursday, causing damage to an industrial area and injuring 1 man, but no fatalities were reported. A strike in the same city on Tuesday struck an apartment building and a warehouse, claiming the lives of at least 12 people and injuring dozens more. According to officials, a missile had earlier destroyed apartments and a warehouse in Odessa, on the southern coast of Ukraine, killing 3 people and displacing hundreds. However, the Ukrainian forces attempting to advance over open ground along a front that is hundreds of miles long have received far more Russian firepower. Jack Watling, a research fellow and specialist in land warfare at the Royal United Services Institute in Britain, wrote in a paper published on Wednesday that the main Russian defensive lines remain 15 to 20 kilometers, 9 to 12 miles, beyond the current Ukrainian positions. The bloody battles to clear foxholes and hand-dug trenches along Russia's front line are reflected in Kyiv's slow progress. Russian artillery and drones will most likely closely follow Ukrainian forces as they attempt to advance into these regions. He also mentioned properly dug trenches and concrete reinforced firing posts, tank obstacles, ground-laid cable to coordinate artillery strikes, and even more mines in the vicinity of the primary Russian defensive lines. While looking for weaknesses, the majority of Ukraine's offensive forces have been held back. Mr. Watling and other analysts, on the other hand, claim that as its troops advance, they will also be less protected by air defenses and may come under even more sustained Russian helicopter and warplane attacks. Mr. Watling stated that the goal of Ukraine's initial push is to convince Russia to send reserve troops from far behind the front line to protect under-threat areas.